I was brought to the palace as a political inconvenience. A human girl with no wolf, no title, no use. The Alpha King made one rule the day I arrived. No one was to touch me. Not the guards, not the nobles, not even him. I thought it was cruelty. It wasn't cruelty. It was the most terrifying thing I'd ever witnessed. A man at war with himself. And losing. For 3 years he kept his distance. 3 years of gold eyes that never quite looked away. 3 years of a jaw so tight I genuinely worried about his dental health. Then, his hand brushed mine at the feast table. 1 second. Barely a touch. The kind of accident that happens between strangers 100 times a day. Except his entire body went still. Except every vow he ever made shattered in the space between one breath and the next. Except he didn't move his hand. Neither did I. My name is Vera, and this is the story of how I accidentally became the most inconvenient person in the entire history of the Ashvale Kingdom. It started, as most disasters do, with someone else's terrible decision. Lord Fenwick of the Eastern Reaches had been skimming grain taxes for 11 years. When the Alpha King's auditors finally caught him, Fenwick panicked and did what cornered men with no dignity and considerable debt always do. He offered something that wasn't his to give. Me. I was Fenwick's ward, an orphan he'd taken in at 7, which sounds generous until you understand that my father had been his most skilled steward, and Fenwick had simply decided that inheriting the steward's daughter was more economical than hiring a replacement. For 15 years I had managed his correspondence, his accounts, his household staff, and the delicate social architecture of his estate, with the kind of quiet efficiency that people only notice when it stops. When Fenwick offered me to the crown as part of his settlement arrangement, he wrote in the agreement that I was gifted in administration and highly capable of palace work. He did not mention that I was human in a court of wolves. He did not mention that I had a tendency to say exactly what I thought at the precise moment I should have said nothing at all. He did not mention that the Alpha King, upon learning these two facts in rapid succession, would look at me across the receiving hall with those gold eyes gone very still and very dangerous, and say absolutely nothing for 11 seconds. I counted. I had nothing else to do while my entire future rearranged itself without my permission. His name was Caius Ashvale, and he was the sort of man that made the air in a room feel different. Not heavier exactly. More awake. Like every molecule had noticed him and was paying attention. He was tall in the way that large predators are tall. Not just height, but presence. The sense that the space around him belonged to him in some fundamental way. He had dark gold hair that he wore back, sharp features that looked carved rather than grown, and eyes the color of old amber lit from behind. When those eyes landed on you, you understood immediately why wolves had followed this particular bloodline for 6 generations. I understood it. And I was not a wolf, and it still made my knees do something embarrassing. He looked at me for 11 seconds. Then he looked at his steward, Lord Cassian, who was a lean, carefully neutral man in his 50s who had clearly survived this long by mastering the art of having no visible opinion. "Is this Fenwick's idea of a settlement?" Caius said. It wasn't a question. Lord Cassian said nothing, which I was beginning to understand was his primary communication strategy. "I'm human," I said, because apparently I had decided that this was the moment to contribute. Everyone in the room looked at me. "I'm aware," Caius said, and there was something in his voice I couldn't identify. Not contempt, not amusement, something more careful than either. "I'm human, and I have no wolf, and I was not told this arrangement had been made on my behalf. So if there's been a miscommunication, I'm happy to return to the Eastern Reaches while your advisors—" "No," he said. "Just that. One word. No." I closed my mouth. He looked at me for another 3 seconds, and something moved behind his eyes that I couldn't read at all, and then he turned to Cassian and said, "She'll take the administrative post in the East Wing and arrange appropriate quarters." And that was how I came to live in Ashvale Palace. The East Wing was beautiful in the way that places are beautiful when no one has thought too carefully about whether beauty is practical. High ceilings with carved stone that collected shadows in interesting shapes. Windows that caught the afternoon light and turned it amber. Corridors that smelled of old wood and something faintly mineral that I eventually identified as the stone itself warming in the sun. My quarters were 3 rooms, a sitting room, a bedroom, a small attached bath, and they were finer than anything I'd had at Fenwick's estate, which wasn't saying much, but I was choosing to find it encouraging. The work itself was easy, not simple. The administrative complexity of a palace this size was genuinely staggering, but easy in the sense that I was competent at it, and competency felt like solid ground under my feet when everything else felt uncertain. I catalogued correspondence. I managed schedules. I coordinated between the household staff and the noble visitors and the various lords who had business with the crown. Within 2 weeks, I had identified 3 redundancies in the supply chain for the North Wing, rewritten the protocol document for foreign dignitary visits, because the existing one was 17 years out of date and referenced a kingdom that no longer existed, and accidentally antagonized Lord Prane of the Western Borders by informing him, with complete accuracy, but apparently unfortunate timing, that his expense report contained 4 mathematical errors. Cassian called me to his office the morning after the Prane incident. "You're good at this," he said, in a tone that made it sound like a complication. "Thank you," I said. "You're also going to make enemies." "I've always made enemies," I said. "I just prefer to make them by being right, rather than by being wrong." Cassian looked at me with an expression I'd come to recognize as his version of either approval or deep concern. With him, it was difficult to tell. He said Prane has lodged a complaint. "About the math errors?" "About you." "I see." He paused. "His Majesty reviewed the complaint this morning. What did he say?" Cassian paused again, longer this time. He said, "Tell her to be more careful about timing, not accuracy." And then he asked me to send him your analysis of the northern supply chain. I sat with that for a moment. "He read my analysis?" "He read your analysis," Cassian confirmed. "And I'll tell you what I told no one else in this palace. That's the first supply chain report he's read in 4 years that he didn't hand immediately back to me. I didn't know what to do with that, so I did what I always do when I don't know what to do with something. I filed it carefully in the back of my mind and went back to work. The rule came 3 days later. I heard it first from Marin, one of the senior housekeeping staff, who had taken it upon herself to serve as my unofficial guide to palace survival. Marin was small and sharp-eyed and had been at Ashvale for 22 years, and she delivered information the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, clearly, without editorializing, while watching your face for signs of distress. She found me in the East Wing records room at mid-morning, pulled the door closed behind her, and said His Majesty has issued a directive. I looked up from the ledger I was reorganizing. "What kind of directive?" "Regarding you specifically." I put down my pen. "No one is to touch you," Marin said. "Not in passing, not in greeting, not under any circumstances. Any staff member or noble who makes physical contact with you is to report it to the household guard immediately." His Majesty's words exactly. I stared at her. She waited. "Why?" I said. She said nothing. "Does he think I'm going to... what, contaminate someone? Is this a human thing? Is he worried I'm..." "It's not that," Marin said, and her voice had gone careful in a way that made me more unsettled, not less. "It's not that at all. I've been here 22 years, girl, and I've seen the king make a lot of decisions, and I can tell you this one didn't come from contempt." "Then what did it come from?" She looked at me for a long moment. "If I had a theory," she said, "I wouldn't share it in a room with thin walls. But I'd suggest you not fight it. The directive will cause you less trouble than fighting it." I opened my mouth. "Less trouble," she repeated firmly, and left. I sat in the records room for a long time after that. The rule was strange in the way that things are strange when they're almost something you recognize but not quite. Nobody hurt me. Nobody was unkind, or not more unkind than people in palaces generally are to someone without a wolf. The guards stepped aside to let me pass without brushing against me. The noble ladies I worked with learned to hand me documents without contact. Servants who would have guided me through unfamiliar corridors by the arm instead walked ahead and pointed. It was like being handled with unusual care, like something precious or fragile. I didn't understand it. What I understood was the king himself, not personally. He was not a man who invited personal understanding. But I saw him often enough, in the way that people who work in the same building see each other, in corridors, in meetings that I attended to take notes, at the edges of formal functions where my job was to observe and record and never quite be part of the room. I watched him hold court. I watched him read correspondence at his desk when he didn't realize anyone could see through the half-open door of his study. I watched him work, and what I saw was a man who was very good at being a king and had arranged his entire existence to contain nothing else. He was not unkind. He was not warm. He operated at a temperature that I came to think of as controlled, everything measured, everything deliberate, the way a long bow is always at the same tension because the archer never lets it slack. He never looked directly at me, which, given the size of the palace and the relative frequency with which our paths crossed due to my work, was actually somewhat impressive. It was also the thing that kept me awake at night, which was inconvenient, and I resented it profoundly. I had not come here to develop feelings about the Alpha King. I had come here because Fenwick had handed me to the crown like a piece of furniture, and I was making the best of it, and the best of it did not include lying in my excellent palace bed thinking about the way a man's eyes could look directly through a room and somehow still find you in it without ever appearing to try. Stop it, I told myself, around the 11-week mark. I was in bed. It was late. I had just spent 20 minutes replaying a conversation in which the king had paused in a corridor, read a report I'd prepared, handed it back to Cassian with 2 words of instruction, and then, in leaving, had passed close enough to me that I'd felt the displaced air of his movement. Not a touch. Not even close to a touch. Just air. I had felt it in my sternum like a bell struck. This is pathetic, I told myself, with great conviction, and fell asleep thinking about his jaw. The seasons changed. Autumn stripped the trees in the palace grounds down to their architecture, and I discovered that watching things stripped bare was something I had a complicated relationship with. Winter came in hard and cold, and the palace shifted into a different rhythm. More fires, more indoor gatherings, the particular social pressure of too many people spending too much time in shared spaces. I learned the court. I learned its rhythms and its fault lines, and its carefully maintained illusions. I learned which lords were genuinely dangerous and which were simply performing danger. I learned which ladies were allies dressed as competition, and which were competition dressed as allies. I learned that Cassian's expressionlessness was itself a form of communication, and that a slight tension at the corner of his eye meant proceed carefully, which was only marginally less useful than an actual spoken warning. I learned that the king had a habit of standing at the window of his study in the early morning, before anyone was officially awake, and that on those mornings his face was different. Not softer, exactly. Less managed, like a door left open that was usually shut. I was not meant to know this. My quarters were on the same side of the east wing, and I kept unreasonable hours, and on 7 separate occasions I had seen that unguarded face through the matching window across the courtyard, and felt it like a hand reaching through glass to close around something I hadn't known was reachable. I stopped looking. Or I tried. The trying was mostly unsuccessful. Spring arrived with the foreign delegations. 3 courts came within 6 weeks of each other, which was a diplomatic maneuver so delicate and so loaded that Cassian aged visibly in the month preceding their arrival. I was in the heart of it. Logistics, correspondence, the endless careful choreography of who sat where and who was addressed before whom, and which symbolic gestures carried which significance to which court. It was the most interesting work I'd done in a year, and I was deeply, genuinely absorbed in it, which is probably why I was completely unprepared for the Renka delegation. The Renka court operated by different rules. They were wolf shifters like Ashvale, but with different customs around hierarchy and contact. In their tradition, a greeting between allies involved a hand placed briefly on the forearm, not a handshake, not an embrace, just that specific touch as acknowledgement of equal standing. Cassian had briefed everyone in my team. I had written the brief. I had simply not written myself into it because I was staff, and staff were not typically greeted by foreign delegations. The Renka ambassador, Lord Davin, was a large man with an open face and the particular ease of someone who had spent decades navigating courts without making permanent enemies. He moved through the receiving hall with confident charm, working the room with practiced warmth, and when he reached me, standing to the side with my records, doing my job, invisible in the way that skilled administrative staff are invisible. He looked at my clearly displayed palace insignia and reached out and placed his hand briefly on my forearm. Standard Renka greeting. 2 seconds. Gone before I'd processed it. The silence that followed was not brief. I heard it before I understood it. A change in the room, a shift in the air, the specific quality of stillness that happens when something has the full attention of someone very powerful. I looked up. Caius was across the hall. He had been in conversation with 3 people. He was no longer in conversation with them. He was looking at Davin's hand, now removed from my arm, already withdrawn, Davin completely unaware that anything had happened, with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger. Something rawer than anger. Something that was over in a quarter of a second. He looked away. His expression closed like a shutter drawn. He returned to his conversation with the precise smoothness of a man who had practiced returning to things. My arm was tingling where Davin had touched it. I spent the rest of the reception being extremely professional and thinking about absolutely nothing. That night I asked Maureen again. She was in my sitting room, which she had begun to use as a place to drink tea and deliver palace intelligence in the evenings, and I had accepted this arrangement because Maureen's palace intelligence was worth more than my privacy. "The rule," I said. "I need you to tell me what you think it means." She looked at her tea for a long time. She said, "Do you know what the bonding sickness is?" "I know the principle," I said. "A wolf who finds their mate and doesn't complete the bond can become compromised, physically, psychologically." She nodded. "The drive to protect," she said. "The drive to keep the mate untouched by others. It's not a choice, exactly. It's a compulsion, especially in early bonding, when the instinct is strongest, but the bond isn't yet sealed. A wolf in that state doesn't always recognize what's happening to them. They make rules. They create distance. They find reasons." I sat very still. She looked at me, and her eyes were not unkind. I said, "That's impossible. I'm human. Humans don't bond with wolves, not that way. We don't have the mechanism for it. The bonding," she said carefully, "is in the wolf, not the human. What the human has or doesn't have doesn't change what the wolf recognizes." I opened my mouth. She said, "I've worked in this palace for 22 years, and I've never said any of this. If you tell anyone I did, I'll deny it." And she stood up and took her tea and went to bed. I sat in my sitting room until the fire died. I did not sleep at all. The next 3 weeks were characterized by what I can only describe as vigorous denial. I was very busy. There was a great deal of work to do. The foreign delegations demanded my full professional attention, and I gave them that attention with the particular intensity of a person who has decided that if she keeps her eyes on the immediate task, the enormous, terrifying thing in the peripheral vision will somehow remain peripheral. It did not remain peripheral. Caius had not changed anything about how he moved through the palace. He maintained his careful non-attention with the same precision he'd maintained it for a year. And yet I felt him enter a room before I saw him. I felt the shift in the air, the change in pressure, the specific quality of the space when he was in it. I felt it the way you feel a change in weather. Not one thing you can point to, but a totality of small signs that your body knows before your mind catches up. I started cataloging it in my head, the way I cataloged everything. Dates and times and circumstances, the objective data. Third morning of the Renka delegation, felt him in the corridor before the door opened. Fourth day, standing at my desk, knew he was behind me a full 8 seconds before he spoke to Cassian. Sixth day, in the formal dining room, felt the exact moment his attention shifted from the diplomat he was speaking with toward the back of my neck, where I was standing with my records, not looking at him. 12 data points in 3 weeks. A pattern. I had spent a year in a palace of wolves learning to read things by evidence rather than instinct, and the evidence was sitting in a column in my head, and I could not make it mean anything else. He knew. He had known since the receiving hall. He'd made the rule because he knew, and he was not going to do anything about it, which was fine, completely fine. He was the Alpha King of Ashvale, and I was a human administrative clerk who had been handed to the crown as a tax settlement, and there was a universe of reasons why he would and should maintain the distance he had maintained for a year, and I respected every one of those reasons. I respected them at 11 o'clock at night in my sitting room with a glass of wine, staring at the wall. I respected them at the spring formal when Lady Orvain, who had been pursuing the king with single-minded dedication since autumn, leaned close to him at the table and touched his arm, and he didn't flinch, didn't go still, just continued his conversation as if the contact were a weather event, neutral and unremarkable. Not like when Davin's hand had touched my arm, not like the quality of stillness that had followed that. The wine was not helping. Nothing was helping. I had fallen, with great inconvenience and no planning whatsoever, into whatever this was, and I had done it slowly enough that I hadn't noticed until I was already in it, which felt like a significant failure of the self-awareness I had previously believed myself to possess. The feast was 3 days before the Renka delegation's departure. It was large, formal, the kind of event that required 6 weeks of planning and generated approximately 900 small crises in the 48 hours before it occurred, all of which crossed my desk. I was tired by the time I sat down. I had been seated at a lower table, appropriate to my station. I was staff, this was correct, but by some accident of logistics that I would later establish had been nobody's deliberate doing, there was one empty chair between my assigned seat and the seat reserved for the king, who traditionally moved through the room and sat briefly at different tables throughout the evening. When he sat down, I was looking at my plate and thinking about nothing more complicated than whether I had actually eaten enough that day. I thought of reaching for the bread at the same moment he did. Neither of us was watching. We were both tired. It was an accident of the most mundane possible kind. His hand closed over mine on the bread basket. For one suspended second, nothing. Not the absence of sensation, the opposite. Every nerve ending I had firing at once in that small area of contact, his warm hand over mine, the roughness of his skin, the weight and temperature of him, real and present in a way that the preceding year of careful distance had made somehow more intense rather than less. Then I heard it. The sound he made. Very quiet. Almost below hearing. Like something he'd been holding for a year had just broken open. He did not move his hand. I looked up. He was already looking at me. Not the managed non-attention I'd grown accustomed to. This was direct and unguarded, and so full of something I didn't have the word for that I felt it physically. A pressure behind my ribs, an unwinding. Neither of us moved. The table around us continued its conversations. The feast hall was loud with 100 people who were, for this moment, not our concern at all. His hand was warm over mine. My heart was doing something structurally inadvisable. "Vera," he said. Just my name. nothing else. I was aware that this was the first time he had said it. In a year of proximity and careful rules and 11 data points and late nights staring at walls, he had never once said my name. Yes, I said, which was not a complete sentence, not an answer to anything. But it was what came out, and apparently it was the right thing because something shifted in his face, some last resistance giving way, and he turned his hand under mine and folded his fingers through mine on the breadbasket that neither of us had actually wanted. We sat like that for 30 seconds. 30 seconds where the feast hall roared around us, and I was warm all the way through my chest, and he was looking at me like I was the first solid thing he'd found after a very long time spent without footing. Then Cassian appeared at his shoulder, with the expression of a man who has arrived at a scene he expected and hoped would never occur. "Your Majesty," he said, "Lord Davin is requesting a word before the third course." Caius did not look at Cassian. He looked at me for 3 more seconds. Then he said, "Tell Davin I'll find him after the meal." And he stood, and as he stood, his thumb pressed briefly against the back of my hand, deliberate, unmistakable. And then he was gone, moving through the hall toward the head table with his usual controlled grace, as if nothing had happened. I stared at the breadbasket. My hand was still warm. Something monumental had just occurred, and I was sitting with a breadbasket and no bread, and the complete inability to remember what any of my previous concerns had been. I ate nothing for the rest of the feast. The morning after was quiet in the way that things are quiet, when they are not actually quiet. I came to my desk and found a note in Cassian's hand asking me to attend a small briefing in the king's study at the 2nd hour. Briefings in the king's study were not unusual. Briefings in which I was the only attendee, which I discovered upon arriving, were. Caius was standing at his desk. He had his back to the door when I entered, and he turned when the door closed, and for a moment, we simply looked at each other across the room. He said, "I owe you an explanation." I said, "I have some theories." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile quite. The beginning of one. He said, "How long have you known?" I said 3 weeks, though I suspect I didn't want to know before that. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "When you arrived." "From the moment you walked into the receiving hall and told me you were human, as if I needed the information. As if the thing that was happening in my chest could be fixed by the relevant data." I said it was a lot of data. "It was," he said, and the beginning of a smile progressed slightly. I said, "So the rule." He said I needed to understand what was happening, whether it was real, whether it would pass. I needed you to be safe from anything I might. He stopped. He tried again. "My wolf doesn't make fine distinctions between threat categories. I needed the court to understand that you were under protection. Without it being a declaration," I said. "Without it being a declaration?" He agreed. "Yes. I considered that," I said, "and has it passed?" The almost smile disappeared. He looked at me with those amber eyes gone serious and clear, and entirely without their usual management. He said no. I said then, "What happens now?" He moved away from his desk, not toward me. He stopped halfway across the room, a careful distance, his hands behind his back in the posture I'd catalogued as him making himself hold still. He said, "I need you to know that I am not unaware of the imbalance. You were brought here without your consent. I have never wanted you to feel—" I said, "You didn't bring me here. Fenwick did." He said, "I kept you here." I said, "I stayed here." That stopped him. I said, "I have been offered 3 independent employment situations in the past year by lords who were impressed with my work. Cassian mentioned them to me. I stayed because I chose to. Because the work here is more interesting than anywhere else I've been offered, and because—" I stopped. "Because," he said very quietly, "because I am apparently incapable of being sensible where you're concerned, and I have accepted that about myself," I said. very recently, with not very good grace. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he crossed the remaining distance between us in 4 steps and stopped in front of me. And I tilted my head back to look at him. This man who had kept a rule for a year and stood at windows in the early morning with his face open and unguarded. This man who had made a sound like breaking when his hand had covered mine over a breadbasket. He raised his hand very slowly, giving me every possible opportunity to move away, and curved it against my jaw. His thumb rested at my cheekbone. His palm was warm. The expression on his face was the thing I'd seen in the early morning through the courtyard window, except closer now, except mine, except looking at me with the specific quality of a man who has stopped fighting something he was always going to lose. He said, "Is this all right?" I said it's been all right for considerably longer than I'm comfortable admitting. And he laughed. A quiet, real sound. Nothing performed about it. Just warmth and something like relief. And it was the most devastating thing I had heard in my entire life. Then he tilted his head and kissed me, and I stopped having thoughts entirely, which was frankly a relief. The weeks that followed were complicated, in the way that things are complicated when they are also very good. There was the matter of the court, which noticed everything and said things in the careful, indirect language of people who know better than to say things directly to a king. There was the matter of Fenwick, who sent a letter of congratulation that was so strategically worded that I read it 3 times to establish that it was, in fact, a single document rather than a series of escalating implications. There was the matter of the Renka delegation's departure, and Lord Davin's extremely composed reaction to the update in my status, which told me he had suspected something at that greeting and had chosen to do the calculation and keep it to himself. There was also Marin, who said nothing to me about any of it except to bring my tea an hour earlier each morning, which was either coincidence or acknowledgement, and with Marin I'd long since accepted that I would never know which. Caius had not immediately made anything public. He moved with his usual deliberation, and I had learned enough about how he operated to understand that deliberation was not hesitation. It was him making certain of things before he committed to them, which, given that the things he was making certain of involved the court and the succession and a question of unprecedented precedent, seemed reasonable. What was not deliberate was the way he looked at me when he forgot to be careful. In meetings sometimes, when I was speaking and he was listening, and his attention came to rest on my face with that unguarded quality he kept for early mornings. Across rooms, at the edge of formal functions where I stood with my records, and he stood with the impossible weight of being the Alpha King of Ashvale, and occasionally, just for a moment, his eyes would find me, and everything else in the room would dim slightly. I was cataloging those too, not because I needed the data anymore, just because I liked having it. 3 months after the feast, he called a formal court assembly and introduced me not as administrative staff but as his chosen mate, the intended Queen of Ashvale, and the silence that followed had about 37 distinct qualities, and I categorized all of them while standing at his side with his hand steady and warm over mine. Then he looked at me and said, "Was that all right?" I said, "You could have warned me." He said, "I wanted to see your face when it happened." I said, "That is a terrible reason." He said, "Yes," he agreed, "but was it all right?" I thought about Fenwick's receiving hall, and the 11 seconds of silence, and one word that had changed the entire direction of my life. I thought about a year of careful rules and early morning windows, and a bread basket, and the sound of something breaking open in a feast hall. "Yes," I said. He lifted my hand and pressed his mouth to the back of it, right there in front of the court, and the lords and the carefully neutral face of Cassian, who I was now fairly certain was capable of smiling, and was simply choosing not to on principle. I squeezed his fingers. He squeezed back. The court made the various sounds that courts make when they have collectively decided that a thing has happened and they had better make their peace with it, and I stood in the hall of Ashvale with my hand in the hand of a man who had kept a rule for a year, because he trusted himself with many things, but he'd never quite trusted himself with this. And I thought about all the ways a life can turn. In one word, in one touch, in the displaced air of a man who keeps his distance and somehow still finds you in every room. I was a human girl with no wolf, no title, and no assigned place in the order of things. I had made my own. The breadbasket, it turned out, had been the entire beginning. Maren, I decided, deserved an extremely nice gift. Something, perhaps, that could be delivered without any particular physical contact. For old time's sake.